quickly, and before getting into the core of the presentation, let's try to recap the core elements that define a sovereign loan and how it is structured. So, as you may already know, by definition, a sovereign loan is a legally binding document which stipulates the financial obligations to which the borrower commits. And this commitment can be distinguished into two sections. On the one hand, we can identify the specific value of funds which is available for disbursement from the creditor, and on the other hand, the repayment conditions which are related to this specific value of contracted funds. So the basic structure of a loan is generally built around four key building blocks. First, the currency denomination, which determines the exposure to FX risk. Then the maturity, which impacts the refinancing risk and debt profile. Thirdly, the repayment scheme, which dictates the cash flow structure. And finally, the interest rate structure, which can be, as you know, fixed or floating and therefore affect the cost stability. So one point quickly here also, this structure that has just been described is the basic structure, but as you may note, it might, however, be amended by embedded options. For instance, interest rate swaps or currency conversions, and which will therefore result in cash flow and risk alterations later on. In terms of lenders, we can distinguish three main categories of sovereign lenders. First, the IFIs, the international financial institutions, then the bilateral entities, and finally the commercial lenders. So yeah, each one of them provides loans at different terms and has a certain degree of flexibility. So if we retain, for instance, the example of the IFIs, they can, for instance, offer some tools that allow to manage some risks, such as the interest rate risk, and so therefore be a bit more flexible and open than some traditional as the bilateral entities as part of G2G's government-to-government deals. So yeah, after setting up the stage, let us now move from the what and the how, from the what, sorry, of instruments we can use to the how we can actually price these instruments. So to price a sovereign loan, and as I was stating in my introduction, we suggest to provide you with a detailed analytical framework, a comprehensive framework that you can use and which is built around 5 distinct steps that we will go through together, and that has been inspired by what international commercial banks are recognizing as being the common practice for themselves assess the pricing of the loans that they grant. So the first step of this analytical framework that we propose consists of benchmarking peer sovereign Eurobonds yields on the secondary market. So Eurobond yields can be considered indeed as reflecting the funding cost of comparable peers. However, one very important point here is that the choice of the peers has to be adequate and aligned with the main features of the sovereign, which is intending to contract this loan. And specifically, this choice of peer has to be made upon 2 main factors. It should be aligned as much at the level of the issuer himself. So, for instance, it should belong to the same credit rating category. And here on the slide, you have 2 distinct credit rating categories that are presented, namely a B-rated category securities and CCC rated securities. But also, it should be aligned at the level of the terms that are required for the loan. So notably, it should aim for the same maturity, the same size of loan, the currency, and so on and so forth. So for instance, let's be concrete and use an example. If a country with a credit rating similar to the one of Benin is intending to contract a loan which is euro-denominated and with a maturity which is inferior to 5 years, then it could use the Benin 2026 Eurobond trading currently on the secondary market as a benchmark, and which was back at the moment where the table was produced, trading at a 6.354%. Another great element for this first step and benchmark that is useful is the Z spread. So yeah, it is another great indicator that can be looked at as part of this first step, as the Z spread allows to isolate the country risk premium over the risk-free rate. So more specifically, this indicator can be considered as even more relevant in the case of loans which have a variable interest rate. And that is because the Z spread allows to incorporate two main factors which reflect very much the investor's appetite. So the first one is the timing factor, meaning the evolution of the market perception throughout time. And as you can see on the graph, the Z spread is evolving throughout time. And the second factor being the punctual, conjunctural events that can happen. And this is well illustrated, as we can see on the graph, with the evolution of the Z spread following Donald Trump's announcement of new tariffs. So we next, as a second step, review the recent sovereign loan transactions, and more precisely their margins. Yeah, so this exercise is pretty interesting, because in addition to being able to have a benchmark that could be used for loan pricing, this allows also to identify if additional securities have been used in order to result into the loan's specific terms. So for instance, let's take the example of Angola in the second table. So Angola 2021 IBRD-backed loan is a great example of how a CCC rated country managed to secure a loan by using an enhancement credit mechanism. However, the main difficulty of such an exercise concerning these loans is that some of them do not present the comprehensive information that goes with the loan, and notably, they may not include the legal provisions that are associated with it. So this is a pretty important point to have in mind, because when analyzing this information, one should keep in mind that it may also exclude some legal provisions that are key in the structuring of this loan. And it is, by the way, the case of all the loans that have been selected in the second table at the bottom of the slide, for which we don't have access to the comprehensive information. So this is a great transition for our next slide and step 3 of our analytical framework for loan pricing, and which is about the relevance of additional securities and most particularly credit enhancements. So as you may know, credit enhancement can indeed lower the pricing for the loan that is sought. But just here, just by the way, a quick point here, by credit enhancement, we also include the use of earmarked cash flows that can be used and dedicated to servicing the debt as well. So it's really credit enhancement mechanism in a very large way. So yeah, one very important point is that the main condition for these instruments, for these credit enhancement mechanisms to effectively enhance the creditor's appetite and bring him around the table at more attractive terms, is that it is when it is backed by external revenues. And by external revenues or external streams, we mean the cash flow which are not, which are completely independent from the sovereign. So a concrete example of how these cash flows can be independent from the sovereign, for instance, are the ring-fenced proceeds that can emanate from, let's say, for instance, a mining project, or the proceeds that come from the exports of raw materials. So in this context, staying in the same example that is given, the mining project or the exports of raw materials, the use of these revenues in order to service the debt can definitely allow the debtor to benefit from significantly better loan terms, as it would be considered by the investor, by the creditor, as an improvement of its credit rating profile. But an important point here again is also the legal robustness of the ring fencing, which is very important and key to the investor and looked at very precisely. As for them, it determines the likeliness of potential changes that can happen in the future. On the contrary, so now we saw when these credit enhancement mechanisms are indeed effective, but when are they not? So on the contrary, if the revenue ultimately depends on the sovereign, then the pricing benefits from the pricing that these credit enhancement, the benefit, sorry, from this credit enhancement mechanism is limited, because the investors don't particularly see an additional value that comes from these additional securities. So under such circumstances, meaning if there is a close link between these revenues and the sovereign, it becomes pretty irrelevant to have recourse to credit enhancement mechanisms. But yeah, let's not say more about this, because the last section of the session is actually wholly dedicated to credit enhancement mechanisms. And let's now move on with the next step, which is the step number 4 of our analytical framework, and which is related to hidden costs. Because yes, so price is very important, of course. It is one big piece of the puzzle. But we wanted to emphasize the importance of assessing the indirect costs that are surrounding the loan agreement. Some creditors may offer loans with more competitive terms and conditions, while they impose restrictive conditions that would, in the end, result in additional economic and financial costs for the sovereign. So a concrete example here are tied loans. In some cases, for tied loans, these types of facilities with this type of facilities, we can have some creditors that require the sovereign to import the specific commodities, and which are, by the way, generally supplied by the same lender himself, at a premium. So meaning at a price which is above market. And therefore effectively increase the overall borrowing cost of the borrower. Similarly, another example of how such a thing can be done, and this is a point which has been raised by some countries during Monday's breakout session. Some creditors may require the mandatory engagement of foreign contractors to work on this project. So at first saying that it would potentially reduce the borrowing cost, but limit the broader economic and social benefit on the country, on the nationals. So with this regard, clauses such as covenants or events of default and specifically governing law are very important and can have a significant impact on preventing this kind of situations. And I insist on the governing law. Finally, so the last step of this analytical framework is the fifth step. We recommend assessing the debt-related risk with the new loan in order to identify and manage the costs and the risks that are associated with the issuer's debt portfolio. So this analysis counts two main components. On the one hand, the dedicated stress test, as stress testing is the full debt portfolio is very important as it ensures that the borrowings fit within a sustainable fiscal path. And by stress testing, we refer to all levels of risk. So the refinancing risk as much as the interest rate, the currency, and so on and so forth. The second component is related to the economics and financial shocks. These shocks allow to capture the broader exposure to which the country is potentially subject when accounting for these new borrowings. But yes, once again here the topic of debt sustainability will be covered more in detail in a specific session which we'll record this morning too. So let's not say more about it. Lastly, and before going deeper into the next section of this presentation, we would like to add an additional element of great importance, which is not part of the 5-step that we have described, but which we believe is crucial. And I am referring specifically to the use of proceeds. So this is a topic that has been raised by several other panelists throughout the week. But the use of proceeds, understanding how the borrowed funds will be deployed is central to assessing actually the efficiency of the loan. Whether the proceeds are financing a productive investment or simply covering current expenses can definitely be game-changing in the long-term debt sustainability. So yeah, in short, it's not just about how much a country borrows, but it's also about how it uses that money that ultimately determines whether the debt is truly efficient or not. Let's now move on to the last section of the deck, which is related to credit enhancement mechanisms, as we mentioned earlier. So on this slide, we introduced the concept that we already talked about of credit enhancement mechanisms as they are, as they are applied to sovereign loans. So these instruments are designed, as we stated, to improve the overall risk profile of the sovereign debt for the creditors. And they allow to access to loans and funding with more favorable terms. So on the left-hand side of the slide, we can identify 3 main categories of key advantages. First, the credit enhancement mechanisms allow to mobilize international financing at lower costs compared to a vanilla debt instrument. And most particularly, they allow some countries to access international capital markets while they, for some of them, have never tapped into it. Secondly, in terms of advantages, these instruments are often a tool within blended finance strategies, meaning that they are designed to attract the private sector participation along the public resources. Thirdly, in terms of main advantages, we wanted to mention the multiplier effect that these instruments can deliver, allowing, for instance, some creditors, just like IFIs, to support a greater number of projects without necessarily having a constraint on their balance sheet. Now, in terms of limitations, let's take a look at the right-hand side of the table. The cost of securing credit enhancement mechanisms can sometimes be substantial, and so therefore sometimes offset the benefit of these lower interest rates that they allow. Also, they can actually introduce some rigidity into the transactions, because the guarantors or the insurers can sometimes impose some specific restrictions and project conditions that require the involvement, for instance, of additional stakeholders. Lastly, these credit enhancement mechanisms can also reduce the sovereign overall financial flexibility by adding some more illiquidity and complexity into the structure. So the next slide deepens our understanding of the two principal forms of credit enhancement instruments by comparing guarantees and insurances. So a guarantee is typically provided by a third party, such as a state or a multilateral institution, and that would assume the risk the risk of non-performance on behalf of the borrower. So in the event of a borrower default, the guarantor directly meets the sovereign's obligations to the lender. So here the key feature is that the guarantee is explicit, irrevocable, and unconditional, which means that for the lenders, they can apply a 0% risk weighting to these exposures. In contrast, the credit insurances are contracted by the lender to cover specific risks. So they generally require the occurrence of a contractually defined event. It can be, for instance, a political event, a political risk, or a default. It is then followed by a claim or an arbitration process in order to have the insurer paying the compensation. So in the case of these insurances, it often adds some, I would say, procedural complexity and potential delays in the payment compared to the first form, which are the guarantees. Lastly, it is important also to note the distinction that should be made between these instruments, so namely the guarantees and the insurances, and those that are provided by export credit agencies, ECAs. So just a brief word about ECAs. ECAs may offer financing or guarantees linked to specific projects under OECD rules, or provide untied facilities that are aimed at promoting broader trade objectives. So I now leave the floor to my colleague Rabi Nawaz, who will be discussing the most common types of guarantees and credit enhancement mechanisms in a general way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pour les francophones, juste pour information, la présentation sera aussi transmise en français pour que vous puissiez aussi la voir. So going back to English, so my colleague Toria was providing some, I would say, theoretical background of what is a guarantee, why is it used, what's the difference between a guarantee and insurance. Let me go a deep dive now on specific instruments that you sovereigns can look at and can be used very concretely to issue commercial debt with these credit-enhanced instruments. So the first one I have in mind is, well, actually, when looking at the guarantees, you have two types of different guarantees. The first one being what's called partial credit guarantees. So this is providing an conditional or an unconditional guarantee to cover the debt service. So here, the guarantor will provide a guarantee for the upcoming debt service that can be that can cover the principal, but also, in some cases, the interest payments as well. So we have here two types of partial credit guarantees. And why do we say it's partial credit guarantees? Is that because usually, actually, the guarantors is not covering the full amount of the project. They might cover 60% or 80% or 90%, but it's very rare, actually, that the full amount of the loan is covered by the guarantee. On what countries are usually doing is blending different guarantees. So they can look at the World Bank that is going to provide, I would say, 60% of the guarantee, and then go to other guarantor like ATD or ICEC that will provide the remaining 40% guarantee. Here, so in terms of guarantee, you have either project finance guarantees or policy-based guarantees. The first one being a guarantee for a specific project, while the second one, the policy-based guarantees, is much more for budget support. Okay. So this is providing a guarantee, like more generally, and then you will have some guarantees specifically covering specific risk, either political risk, as we are having here, so a breach of contract, a change of law, a transfer restriction, or war or civil disturbances that might affect the government ability or the project ability to service the debt. So when one of the events that you have here occurs, you will have this guarantor or this issuer that is going to come up on basically serve the debt on your behalf. So looking at what are the instruments you can have. Here on these slides you have two main type of instruments. The first one being provided by the World Bank, and the second one provided by the African Development Bank. Looking at the World Bank, with the impulsion of the new president did a big push in terms of guarantees. Now, actually, since July last year, they have improved the way that countries can access to the guarantee by having an unified platform. And this unified platform is held at the MIGA, and is providing the type of guarantees I was mentioning in the previous slide. What is interesting here is to have in mind is that IDA countries usually have a preferential booking treatment, what I was saying here of 1 to 4, which means that with, I would say, an example of 100 million of allocation that you have at the World Bank, you can raise 4 times the allocation you have. So by using 100 million of your allocation, you can actually have a guarantee covering 400 million. So you have this 1 to 4 ratio that you can use. So this is enabling you already to multiply the effect on the amount that you can raise. Here, then you will have some indicative terms that you have. So here again, these terms are purely indicative. If you are going through this process, we suggest to come back with the World Bank to confirm it. Because the pricing is obviously very changing. And as I was saying, so this was the case of the World Bank, and then the two type of then you can also have some insurances through the MIGA that is covering 95% or 90% of the equity for political risk on non-honoring financial obligation. So this is what you have on the left side of the slide. And this is more specifically covering trade finance, So which means by nature very short-term debt. Looking at the African Development Bank, what you can have here is two types of guarantees again, partial risk guarantee and partial credit guarantees. Another point that is actually very important to have in mind is that to have access to these guarantees, usually you will need to have a low to moderate risk of debt distress. So looking at your DSA risk profile is very important. On both the World Bank and the African Development Bank is looking very closely at that when assessing whether you can have access to them. If you are in a high risk of debt distress, you can still have access to these guarantees, but then it's on a case-by-case, I would say even exceptional basis, and you will have to show that the transaction that you are envisaging is going to improve significantly the debt profile of your country. Again, here you have some type of example of the type of loans, on the characteristics of the loan that you might have on this. What is actually very interesting to have to see here, here again on the bottom left of the slide, is that, well, through these guarantees you will be able to first issue commercial debt at more favorable terms, but also at longer maturities, on having access to basically to financing that might be difficult otherwise. Very quickly, so I was mentioning the World Bank and the African Development Bank. You also have other actors that you might have a look at, notably, for example, ATD, ICEC through the Islamic Development Bank, and IAB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So when looking at ATD, usually what countries are doing is what I was mentioning, remember? So World Bank and the African Development Bank might provide only 60% of guarantee, and then you can come up to ATD to cover the remaining part. ICEC here, actually, they are covering what we have seen in the countries that we have support in implementing this. I would say it's mostly more than 90% of the loan being covered by the guarantee. But again, here you might have some conditionalities attached. For example, for the African, for ICEC, you will need to be only for export of local sale goods and services to Arab countries, or imports. It has to be related to the Arab countries. For RTD, it's covering mostly political risk, credit risk on the non-honoring of the sovereign obligations, and you would need to be members of each of these institutions to get access to the guarantees. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, it's also it's an MDB, so a multilateral development bank that is historically based in Asia, in Beijing, but is more and more present on the African continent. We have seen, for example, some project with Egypt being the first one, the first countries that has that got the guarantee from from AIIB. And what is interesting here is that you might have it for issuing specific bonds, for example, panda bonds, so bonds denominated in Chinese yuan. And also what is very important to have in mind here is that AIB operations is targeting specific sectors, green infrastructure, connectivity. On here, having a connectivity rational with Asia is actually a plus. Private capital mobilization, and technology-enabled infrastructure. So here we wanted to provide you with an overview of all the different players, of the different stakeholders that are present in the that might offer guarantees. Please feel free to ask any questions on that if needed. And if we're done here, I think it's my colleague Victor now who needs to talk about, who will talk to you about the different instruments more globally that sovereign can have access to when it comes to financing. Thank you very much.
Good morning once again, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I do not plan to make this a long odyssey on stuff that we already know. I will try to limit my comments and my discussion to aspects of all of this really interesting and important stuff that may be a bit more nuanced and not readily available. Okay, great. Please, may I have your attention? This is going to be a very quick run-through. I believe we are mostly familiar with the instruments that we use in incurring debts, and I will just try to make this as quick as possible. I should be in front of you for no more than 25 minutes. Thank you. So how do governments borrow? And that's effectively what we're trying to discuss. Yesterday, we talked about private contracts or private law, which effectively are the contracts and the bond indentures by which governments incur debts. And here we are saying that government borrowing isn't a one-size-fits-all. And so what we find mostly is that sometimes governments determine to borrow either through loan documents or bonds. And the reasons why they decide which instruments to use can be based on market conditions at a particular time. It could also be based on investor appetites at a particular time, and it could be based on the current fiscal strategy of the government. And so what we are finding more and more is if a government has serious economic crunch and they want to, their strategy is to get a cheaper type of debt, they are more likely to go for loans from multilateral institutions, or shall I say concessional loans from multilateral institutions. There's a reason why I had to clarify that, because not all multilateral loans are concessional, and we'll get to that. So I put an interactive box there for you to think about the last sovereign borrowing decision your country made, what instrument was used, why, was it driven by cost, speed, risk, or external influence? Oftentimes also, governments based on relationship can determine to borrow using a loan document or a bond. It depends on a multifarious kinds of reasons, quite frankly. And so on the next slide, I talk about the fact that not all public debt is raised on the open market. It's raised via bonds. And so sometimes governments can borrow from official creditors or multilateral loans. And I will just talk a bit about bilateral loans and multilateral loans. So bilateral, oftentimes when we use bilateral within this sector, people often mistake it to be just loans between governments to government, but bilateral literally means between two. And so it could be a loan between a government and a commercial creditor, and it's referred to more broadly as bilateral. But generally, when people say bilateral loans, they refer to inter-sovereign loans. And this is really just direct government-to-government lending. The problem with bilateral loans is it could create interdependencies. And it's problematic because sometimes governments use loans as an extension of geopolitical influence. We've seen that over and over again. We saw that between Russia and Belarus. And so Russia supported the presidency of President Alexander Lukashenko, I believe. And President Lukashenko has in turn been very favorable to Russian activities in Kyiv and Ukraine more broadly. And this is one of the ways we saw the same thing almost with Egypt and the United States. There's that kind of thing to think about when you are having bilateral government-to-government loans. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, the focus of this session would not be to tell you what you already know, but would be to flag things to just be aware whilst you are looking at things you already know. Also, I want to talk about multilateral loans. And so you see borrowing from institutions like the World Bank, even the African Development Bank or the IMF, whilst mostly for low-income countries, those loans are concessional. And by concessional, I shouldn't define that. I'm talking to economists and finance people. So they're concessional. And one thing to be careful of, or two things to be careful of, is first, because they're concessional loans, and these institutions have development mandates, they typically require serious structural adjustment programs. And I'm sure some of us here have been in negotiations with, say, the International Monetary Fund, where they've requested adjustments to your fiscal strategy, adjustments to, even on some level, your politics, adjustments to your economic policies, etc. And so this is the baggage that concessional loans from multilaterals can come with. But also importantly is to note that not all multilateral loans are concessional. And so you find that the African Development Bank, for instance, has a non-concessional lending window. You find that the World Bank, via the International Bank for Restructuring and Settlement, I believe, for Restructuring and Development, IBRD, also have a non-concessional window. And what this means in effect is that they are not going to advance concessional loans to countries that have strong credit ratings or who are deemed, creditworthy, but also importantly, countries who are not lower income countries. And so middle income countries like South Africa, for instance, got a non-concessional loan from the African Development Bank. Also, you see the same thing with India, got a non-concessional loan from the IBRD. The interesting nuance to point out here is that even if the loans are non-concessional, they are still usually better than the rates, the commercial rates, right? I just thought to clarify that. Yeah, I think there's a prompt there that I would like someone from, I had my list yesterday and I called some countries. Again, calling countries is not to put anyone on the spot, it's just to understand the context of your country. So there's a prompt here that says, imagine a bilateral lender offers a loan at 2%, but requires a sovereign guarantee and future export revenues as collateral. Do you take the deal? Anyone? 2% is, okay, you know what? I would just call on Gambia. Can someone from Gambia, please? What do you think? A bilateral lender offers a loan at 2%, requires a sovereign guarantee and future export revenues as collateral. Do you take the deal? Sorry, you say no? I think we have an answer. Yeah, I will come to Gambia, but I want to give the gentleman in front here an opportunity to share his opinion. Do we have the microphone, please?
The thing is that you don't see the full picture there. Okay. And although 2% is very attractive, the thing is that a sovereign guarantee of food and future export revenues. Which future export revenues? What future export revenues?
For context, let's assume it's a gold exporting country like Ghana. So let's say future exports revenues on gold.
On gold.
On gold, yes.
It's like I mean, I would rather have that gold for my own purposes than collateralize it away. It sounds very good, but there's for me, I will never enter into a deal like that because I think there's other ways that government can do to borrow cheaper.
Yeah.
And not by these announcements.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And again, there's no right or wrong answers because all of us here have probably been involved in deals that we've had to decide, should we take this or should we leave it? So this is just saying how you're thinking about some of these issues. Does someone from Gambia want to say something in 1 minute just so we can move forward? Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Krubali, okay.
It's okay. we want to align with our colleague over there that, you know, there are a lot of ambiguity around this because in terms of clearly explaining the terms and conditions, it looks like it falls short of that one. And, you know, mortgaging your future export, in to what extent the terms and conditions, you know, governing, you know, that guarantee, all these things are not clearly explained. So we would want to, and if you look at even in the interest rate, given the fact that you probably want to emphasize on concessionality as much, even with that, we still feel that it is a little bit on the high end.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And very interesting points we are making here. And we will do more of this in the afternoon session when we talk about loan documentation. All of you will be lawyers today. And this is how we are thinking, even as lawyers, this is how we are thinking of our clauses. So 2% sounds like a very attractive deal. But when you look at the fact that you are mortgaging potentially your future revenues on your country's commodities, that is dangerous. It's something to really think about. And oftentimes, all of these details can be hidden in the fine prints of contracts. Okay, so deep dive, government bonds. We know what a government bond is. It's a certificate of indebtedness, really. And we have both international and local bonds. Well, the whole thing about international and local bonds, I would just preface that by saying international bonds, we can refer to those as those issued in international currencies. So they are technically called euro bonds. So they don't need to be in euro as a currency, but international to the country issuing them. And then local bonds or domestic bonds are bonds issued within the local currency and under the local law. Now, it's very interesting because when we deep dive into how do you determine if a bond is actually local or if it's international, or how do you determine if a debt is a local debt or an international debt, there's a whole debate on it. But I just aligned myself to the IMF's position, and the IMF's position is a bond's status is determined by the residence of the holder. And this usually comes to play during restructurings. And we'll get to restructuring, I believe, on Thursday, and we'll talk more about this. I don't want to belabor the points. The final thing is specialized bonds. We'll get more into this, but you know we have different kinds of bonds. So you find, again, the whole idea is bonds are, debts usually comes in the form of loans or bonds. And with bonds, we have a huge assortment of bonds. We have green or ESG bonds, which can be green, blue, or whatever color they want to put it these days. We have commodity-linked bonds, GDP-linked bonds. We have digital bonds these days. We have diaspora bonds these days. Some of these bonds we will discuss in a nutshell very shortly. Oh, so I did a whole deep dive. I believe the slides will be made available, but it's a bit of deep dive into what constitutes traditional domestic debts versus international debts. And I mentioned that there's a blurring, which means the dichotomy no longer maps neatly into economic categories. So, and that complicates restructuring. Typically, we'll think that a debt issued in the local currency of the country under the local law is a domestic debt, and the debt issued in an international currency and under an international law, and by international law, I don't mean the body of international law, I mean another country's law, is international bonds or international or external bonds. But in reality, people from different parts of the world are also buying bonds that are domesticated or that are domestic, and people who are domestic are buying bonds that are international. So how then do you determine if the holders or if this particular debt can be referred to quite specifically as an international or a domestic debt? I wouldn't go into the economic metrics. That's why we have the GSA, who are simply fantastic. I didn't even, I'm sure we heard from them earlier, and they did a fantastic job talking about the economic dimensions of our discussion. But this slide should give some perspective. It says it's no longer enough to classify a debt by the old rule of local versus foreign currency or jurisdiction. One must look at who holds it and under what law. So it's a bit more complicated, but like I said, the IMF's guiding principle is based on the residence of the holders of the bond. So treasury bills and notes are also types of bond. I'm sure we are all familiar with the terms of themselves, but what is necessary to be known is treasury bills are short-term and usually between 1 to 5 years. And I like to define it in this way to be very, very simplistic. So a treasury bill is a government debt that is bought or sold at a discount and redeemed at the full face value. So for instance, we're in Ghana, so say the government sells a bill of 1,000 cedis, but sells it to buyers at 950 cedis. And at the end of the term, usually 6 months or a year, the government buys back the bond at 1,000 cedis. And so the investors get 50 cedis as their benefit or as their interest or as their profits from that arrangement. With notes, they're usually medium-term treasury arrangements. And so these ones are like bonds. Now, they're not like bonds. They're actually bonds, just medium-term bonds. And the way they work is the government, in that same scenario of 1,000 cedis, the government agrees to a percentage to advance to the investors. And for a longer time, say 5 years. So you buy a bond of a treasury note of 1,000 cedis, and then at a 5% yearly interest rate, and at the end of your 5 years, so every year you will get 5% of 1,000, and at the end of the 5 years, you will get back your 1,000 plus all of the interest you've accrued in the previous year. So that's simplistic enough. Is there any country here that's considering sukuk bonds? There are a few I know on the continent who have issued, like Nigeria. But is there any country here who has issued? South Africa has issued as well. So do you want to, please can we get the microphone to Mr. Sir?
The thing is with a sukuk bond it's a diversification mix. It's another pool of funding that's available for your funding of your deficit. Okay. But it takes time because you have to establish a sort of a committee or a forum that will make sure that whatever asset in government, and you need to engage with that sort of, say you want to put, and what type of asset you want to put against this. Say it's a road or a dam or something else. But it's to construct, the main thing here is to construct this thing. Takes time.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's a way of, I always see it as a way of sort of hide, or you need to be compliant, Sharia compliant. But yeah, so it's a way that you can structure something to get access to a certain pool of fund. Yeah. But at the end of the day, it's still a bond on your book.
It is.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yohan. And just to, I know that I'm also a bit conscious of time. We'll do a lot of talking, hopefully, in the afternoon session, because we are the ones here who will be negotiating the loan documentation, not me. I'm not doing anything in that session. Okay, so, thank you very much for the perspective. And I think one of the easiest things to know about how sukuk bond, at least in theory, is structured and what it's attempting to achieve, is first that it's trying to be, or it's a bond that is Sharia compliant. And Sharia bans what we know as riba, which is profits, interest. And so as opposed to having an interest in the bond structure, what investors get is profits. And the simplest way to explain how this works in reality is the government intends to, for example, build a road. And I must underline by saying that sukuks must be tied to an actual asset. So, you know, unlike traditional bonds where you can get the bond, get the money, and then decide to do whatever you want to do with it, with sukuks, you must have an asset, an infrastructure in place that you are looking to develop with the proceeds of that sukuk. And so what the investors get is that they contribute money to the purchase or the running of these assets. And so it could be that the government wants to build a road. And so as in legal speak, we establish an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, and then that special purpose vehicle owns the infrastructure to be built, and the special purpose vehicle acts as a trustee in favor of the government, in favor of the investors. And effectively, the investors advance the money under the bond, under the sukuk bond, and then the road or the school or the hospital is built. And when it is built, whatever rents or profits or receipts that is gotten from that infrastructure that has been built will be paid to the investors for the period of the sukuk, say if it's for 10 years. And so every year, instead of the investors to get interest, they are getting rent that is accruing from the assets that was purchased by with the sukuk bond, receivables. And, or it could be that if there is no tangible rent, if it's not a property, for instance, if it's not a road that has toll, for instance, the government sets aside on its budget an amount to be paying to the investors as profits for them giving the government the opportunity to use that asset. And so what has really happened is that investors are the owners of the assets, and the government pays the owners of the assets rent or royalties for using this asset for, let's say, 10 years or 5 years. And at the end of the 5 years, the government purchases the assets and pays, and it purchases the assets from who? From the investors who actually own that asset. It's a very interesting structure, but I think it's worth considering given how the amount of flexibility it gives to the government. You don't have to pay interest, you're not floating, there's no changing of exchange rates per se that is affecting how much you are giving or receiving. But what it does is that you have some sort of stability, and you can plan ahead that in the next 5 years we'll pay rent of whatever amount of money, and then by the end of 5 years we'll purchase this property or this asset. The reason why assets are so critical to this arrangement is because unlike other bonds, a sukuk bond must be tied to an asset, since ownership rests on the investors and not the government at the initial stage.
Thank you. I have two questions on the operation of the sukuk. One is it allowed that government can, if they set aside a certain amount of money to pay the rent, they can also prorate the capital that was given to them by the investors alongside the payment. That is one. Two, what about investments that are not designed to bring in profit from the people, like a road that is not going to be towed? What do they now call the rent? Because I know sukuk avoids issues of interest.
Yes.
So what name do we call what they pay to the investors? Just those two questions, please.
Very much, sir. Just very briefly to answer the first question, if the government can prorate the capital, there's nothing on paper or in theory that deters the government from doing that. But the structure of a sukuk is that the government doesn't own the assets, and then it determines to buy the assets at a particular time. The reason why governments will favor this structure is because they don't have the money at the time to purchase all of the assets at that time. It will be it's rare. I haven't seen that in practice where a government decides to prorate the capital, but nothing stops the government from doing that if they have the resources. The second question about where the underlying asset is not revenue generating is a very good question. What happens? recall that a sukuk asset belongs to the investors, not the government, at the initial stage. When the investors generate the money needed for the assets, they buy the assets, and as lawyers, we create what we call a special purpose vehicle to hold that asset in trust for the investors. And so for the period of the sukuk, the government is using this road. For using the road, the government has to pay rent to the owners or profits to the owners. That's the structure. So the government is paying for what they don't own. And after about 10 years, the government buys the asset in full. The whole idea is that it gives the government fiscal breathing room for that period of using the asset without buying it outrightly. And then by the end of the 10 years or 5 years of the sukuk, the government then pays the actual amount that was agreed at the initial point. So it's almost like a forward or a future under securitization law or securitization practice, where the government is paying for something in the future that's the price has sort of been predetermined 10 years ago. So in that way, it's attractive to the government because they're paying in 2030 what they arranged in 2020. Is that helpful? Okay. Look at that. So we are almost done. Almost done. So, great. So I have 5 more minutes, I suppose. And it's just to discuss emerging and innovative instruments. Remember in the beginning I mentioned that one of the things about bonds is that bonds have varying, evolving types. One of the types are diaspora bonds. Now the way diaspora bonds work is that the government issues a bond to its diaspora population. So people from Syria, the government of Sierra Leone, for instance, issues a bond targeting Sierra Leoneans who live in every country in the world except Sierra Leone. And the idea or the wisdom behind this bond is that the bond will be issued at a cheaper interest rates because the people who are buying the bond are citizens or indigents of the country, and they would possibly look favorably upon their government and give them a bond at a cheaper rate. And the problem with this bond is that the citizens in the world need to trust or at least like enough the governments. And what we find often is that governments don't have the political wherewithal or the political goodwill to incur the favors of their indigents abroad. And another concern is that sometimes some indigents abroad are living illegally. If they ever purchase a diaspora bond, they expose themselves to the government of the country where they're living now. There is a chance that because your name is on an official record as a bondholder to a government, if you were hiding before as an illegal immigrant, you can no longer hide. And so on that basis, there are immigrants that don't consider this bond. But is it a real thing? It's a real thing. Israel issued a diaspora bond a few years ago. There are a few countries in Africa who are trying to. I haven't been so successful for the reasons I mentioned, but it's an emerging instrument. Another instrument is digital bonds. This is very interesting, and I cannot talk about this exhaustively in 1 minute. What we need to know about digital bonds is that first, countries are moving towards the digitization of bond issuance. So unlike the traditional bond issuing where you go to the bank, you settle with paper records, etc., with digital bonds, we have a digital blockchain ledger where the money is transferred on the blockchain, received on the blockchain, the bond is agreed on the blockchain. Slovenia last year in July was the first country to actually issue a digital bond. But guess what? There's serious appetites for digital bonds. We're seeing this with other countries. In February of the same 2024, Hong Kong supported a digital or backed a digital native green bond. We saw the same approach by countries like I think it's Slovenia, there's Hong Kong, there is Luxembourg. Just in February this year, supported the European Investment Bank to issue supranational digital bonds. So there's some appetite in that area. It's something to be familiar with. And then we have GDP-linked bonds. Zambia is a good example of how this can work. Pursuant or further to their restructuring in the last 2-3 years, the part of their bond or their restructuring package is that the bonds that will be issued will be based on GDP behaviors, more or less. And the way that works is when the GDP of the country is improved, the payments or the exposure of the government increases. And when the GDP is not performing so well, or when the economy is not performing so well, the amounts they have to pay on the bond reduces. So the bond sort of mirrors the economic flow of the country. We have sustainability-linked bonds, and effectively, and more generally, ESG bonds are just bonds that are linked to the environment, sustainability. We have green bonds issued in Nigeria, and I think in South Africa. We have blue bonds issued in Seychelles in 2018. Couple of bonds just like that that are linked towards preserving the environment. The core thing to be aware of with green bonds is that they are earmarked for a particular green purpose or a blue purpose. Green if it relates to the environment, strictly speaking. Blue if it relates to the marine body, strictly speaking. That should be it. I think we'll have more time in the afternoon to discuss loan negotiation, and thank you for your attention. I would probably take one question or two questions if there's any. There's a question, but please, there's a question from, the Gambia and Madam Adja here. So first to Madam Adja and then to the Gambia. I don't think we have time. Mr. Chidi, do we have any more time? The session is overdue. I'm sorry. The two questions. Okay. So, Adja, please.
Mine is not really a question. I want to talk about the sukuk because Nigeria has experience issuing sukuk.
Yeah.
We started issuing sukuk since 2017, and the main purpose is, number one, to diversify our funding base. Number two, we issued it for financial inclusion, meaning that there are some investors in Nigeria, in the local market, that are not interested in going to invest in bond and other traditional instruments. They prefer sukuk. Yeah. Sukuk was issued by government in 2017. It was oversubscribed. Each time we issue sukuk, we find out that it's oversubscribed by about 300% or even something like that. And currently, if you go to Nigeria, you see so many roads labeled Sukuk Road, which means those the proceeds from the Sukuk issuance were used to construct roads. And the payment, like the last person that asked that question, what is it called? Is it called interest? No, it is called rental income. And how do the government? It's not the roads are not told. How does government pay for it? Government make provision annually in the budget to pay for this rental income that is due to the sukuk holders. So that's just my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajay. That's very helpful. Thanks for the clarity. No, to the man from Gambia, we have two questions. I'm so sorry. Maybe the next round we'll have another. I will ensure you speak first at the next round, please. I think the man from Gambia actually raised his hand.
Merci.
Yes.
Merci. C'est Moutari Dimoussa, ministère de l'économie et des finances du Niger. Voilà. C'est un commentaire et une question. C'est même adressé aux deux premiers présentateurs. Si vous pouvez clarifier, tant mieux. C'est-à-dire, dans l'exposé de deux premiers présentateurs, ils disent que le fonds souverain, là, il est vraiment contraignant. C'est vrai, pour les États, il est difficile vraiment de prêter à de telles conditions, le taux d'intérêt fixe, flottant et puis un peu élevé. Il est à court terme. Il est difficile pour les États d'emprunter ce genre de fonds pour financer des projets de développement. Et d'ailleurs, elle-même, elle a souligné, la présentatrice, en disant certains États qui peuvent prêter, ils peuvent prêter sur le taux d'intérêt du Bénin de 2006. Donc, moi, je pense que est-ce qu'ils peuvent donner un exemple réussi de 2 pays ou 3 qui ont prêté ce genre de fonds et que c'est un exemple réussi sans que ce pays-là soit traîné en justice, où on peut saisir leurs avoirs à l'étranger, etc., etc. Merci.
Donc votre question, c'est de savoir est-ce qu'il y a des pays, il y a des créanciers qui ont prêté à court terme à des pays à des taux similaires à ce qu'on avait pour les eurobonds, c'est ça? Okay.
C'est ça.
Alors, effectivement, alors, il faut ensuite regarder de quel eurobond on parle et de quelle souche on va regarder. Mais effectivement, en théorie, le niveau de trading sur le marché secondaire, il représente effectivement quel est le rendement attendu par les investisseurs pour un pays spécifique. D'accord ? On avait regardé l'exemple du Bénin, qui, de mémoire, s'échangeait sur le marché secondaire aux alentours de 6,2%. Mais encore une fois, là, on a regardé le Bénin. On peut regarder un autre exemple. On peut regarder, par exemple, on va dire le Sénégal aujourd'hui, qui emprunte à des taux de court terme, en fait, où les eurobonds s'échangent sur le marché secondaire à des taux beaucoup plus élevés, aux alentours de 13%. Ou encore d'autres pays comme le Mozambique, par exemple, ou d'autres exemples qui montrent bien que les taux peuvent être vraiment différents de pays à pays. Ensuite, oui, il y a des créanciers qui prêtent à des taux très court terme comme cela. Alors ensuite, et encore une fois, en fait, c'est le but aussi de toute la présentation de dire qu'en fait, les taux qu'il faut regarder, mais en fait, ils s'apprécient avec plusieurs autres considérations, dont notamment les garanties. Mais je ne peux pas donner de nom de pays spécifique pour des questions de confidentialité. Mais effectivement, oui, il existe aujourd'hui des créanciers commerciaux qui prêtent à du très court terme. Et ces créanciers-là, alors, tout dépend du pays, mais pour des pays qui sont notés triple C, ils vont prêter aux alentours de 13-14%. Et ça représente à peu près les taux de rendement qui sont observés sur le marché secondaire des eurobonds pour les créanciers, enfin pour les pays notés triple C. Je ne sais pas si ça répond à votre question.
Je vais dire un exemple réussi de pays qui ont prêté et investir et que sans qu'il y ait de contentieux.
En réalité, j'ai envie de dire que le contentieux, c'est un peu l'exception normalement. La plupart des pays, on prenait l'exemple du Bénin, le Bénin ou le Sénégal ou la Côte d'Ivoire ont émis des eurobonds sans aucun contentieux. Et en fait, la plupart du temps, comment ces pays-là font pour ne pas avoir de contentieux évidemment, ils remboursent leurs dettes, mais ce qu'ils font également, c'est qu'ils font des opérations de gestion de passifs qui permettent de racheter les encours existants via l'émission d'une nouvelle dette. Et je ne sais pas si vous avez vu, mais sur le tableau qu'on avait vu tout à l'heure, pour le Bénin, par exemple, l'obligation qui arrive à maturité en 2026, il y avait un encours très petit, de 36 millions de dollars de mémoire. Et pourquoi le montant était si petit? Parce que la majorité de la souche a déjà en réalité été rachetée par le Bénin. Et donc en réalité, en 2026, ils vont devoir qu'une très petite partie de l'encours restant. Et en fait, c'est comme cela que ces pays-là font pour gérer leurs dettes. C'est via des opérations de gestion de passifs comme cela pour pouvoir activement gérer leurs dettes. Et justement, activement gérer leurs eurobonds.
Please let us put hands together for the presenters, Rabi, Troya, and Victor. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We have eaten into the time of the next session. So we'll have to go quickly into the next session, session 13, which is going to be taken by Rabi. So Rabi, you remain, two of you. Okay, both Rabi and Turaya. So you remain here and let us listen and participate in the next session, which is assessing debt sustainability prior to new debt incurrence, the why and the how. Unfortunately, we've lost substantial time on this, but it's meant to be 1 hour, 30 minutes. So let's see whether we can do it within an hour or hour, 15 minutes, right? Okay, thank you very much. So let's listen to you. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you very much. If we could please have the presentation projected. So I'll try to be very quick on this one as requested. And so this next session will be, in this next session we will be discussing how one can assess debt sustainability prior to new debt issuance. And this topic, we considered it very important as it is a critical process to ensure the borrowing, to ensure that the country's borrowing is well aligned with the repayment capacity of the sovereign and its long-term feasibility. So without any more wait, through this presentation, we will cover three main components. First, we will go through the concept of debt sustainability, and why it matters. Second, we will see how to assess new debt using the debt sustainability analysis, also known as the DSA. And finally, we will go through two case studies that demonstrate the practical applications of the DSA. So let us begin with the concept of debt sustainability. In public finance, in a general way, debt sustainability, as you may know and as it was already stated in several sessions before, refers to a government's ability to meet its current and future debt service obligations without resorting to debt restructuring or compromising its growth and development goals. The debt sustainability reflects the balance between the borrowing for development and maintaining the macroeconomic stability within the country. So in practice, a sustainable debt can be defined as allowing for financing needs while preserving the fiscal space to absorb the shocks that the country might be facing. And what is a DSA, a debt sustainability analysis? A DSA is the analytical tool that is used to assess whether the debt is sustainable over time or not. As it was defined by the IMF for low-income countries, debt is considered sustainable when there is a high likelihood that the country is capable of meeting all current and future financial obligations. So this assessment, as you may already know, requires the necessary policies for debt stabilization, that they should be both feasible and compatible with, as said earlier, the country's development objectives. The low-income country debt sustainability framework, LIC-DSF, looks at the debt carrying capacity and the project's debt indicators under baseline and stress scenarios for a horizon of 10 years. And at the issue of this test, it assigns a risk of rating and classifies them between 3 categories: low, moderate, and high debt distress. Why do countries conduct a DSA? Countries conduct a DSA to guide their borrowing decisions in alignment with their ability to service their debt. So, in other words, the DSA allows to guide the borrowing decisions that are made by the country by matching their financing needs with their repayment capacity. So, to cut a long story short, the DSA serves as a early warning system for debt distress risk. It also supports the design of multi-year financing plans, and especially enables governments to anticipate the discussions with external stakeholders, including the IMF and other partners, therefore strengthening a sovereign's negotiation position. So it is an extremely important tool as well to be used internally by the sovereign. So in this matter, a sovereign-owned DSA allows the country to run independent and credible analysis that would help it in its negotiations further with the other stakeholders. So what does the DSA cover? As stated before, DSA is a fiscal tool which is designed to assess how the future financing needs and borrowing will impact the debt metrics, such as the debt to GDP, the debt to exports, the service ratio, and so on and so forth. But let's keep that for the next section, which is dedicated to concrete case studies. It helps in designing strategies for financing gross fiscal need and identifying debt vulnerabilities of the country. But importantly, it does not provide the macroeconomic forecasts nor assist in the operational preparation of debt transactions. But on the reverse, it guides on the decision making regarding the impact of the new debt, whether it is sustainable or not. So, regarding the IMF and World Bank debt sustainability frameworks, which we could abbreviate to League DSF, it can be distinguished into two sections, 2 parts. The input and computations on the one hand, with the macro fiscal projections, debt stock and service data and funding plans, and the risk assessment on the other hand, which determines the mechanical risk levels based on whether the key indicators breach threshold under both baseline and stress tests. So this framework allows to identify four levels of risk: low, moderate, high, and in case of debt distress, in case of default or restructuring, the country is considered as being in debt distress. And the final risk rating incorporates the judgment alongside all these mechanical results, therefore allowing to account for the country specific factors that enhance the credibility of this whole assessment. So without wait, and as we won't spend too much time on the theoretical part, and leave you with some case studies that will be conducted by Rabi, and which will give you more input about how this tool is concretely used with these case studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toria, for this. So, as mentioned, we are now going to deep dive on a specific methodology that we are proposing to assess the impact of a new debt in the DSA. So, first, let's look at what are the impact of a new financing on your debt profile. Obviously, a new financing will have a negative impact, right, on your debt liquidity, on your debt solvency profile. Why this is because, well, a new debt, looking at the solvency profile first, a new debt will obviously increase your debt stock, right? Especially looking at the DSA, it will increase the present value of your public debt or your external debt. This is the indicator that is looked in the DSA, and to properly assess it, you will need to look at the degree of concessionality of your loan. Obviously, this degradation of your solvency profile will need to be assessed also with the macroeconomic profile of your country. So looking at your GDP, at your revenue, or at your exports. Having a new loan will also have an impact on your liquidity profile. Obviously, having a new loan will increase the projected debt service for the next years, and this will need to be properly assessed, notably looking at the government ability to repay this additional debt. Again, here also we would need to have a look at that, looking at your GDP, your export or your revenues. So, looking at the DSA more specifically, how will you be able to assess it? Well, what do you need to do in your model is to update the financing assumptions of your DSA and to incorporate in the financing strategy that you have in your model to add this additional financing. And then, once you have done it, you will have to look at your DSA ratios. So in the methodology that we are proposing, we have different steps to analyze it. And the first step that you have here in this slide is, first, you need to assess the current debt profile of your DSA. So here, in this example that we are showing here, we have, for this exercise, we have a country that is presenting these external debt indicators. And from what we are seeing here is that this country is facing both solvency and liquidity, I would say, pressures. Why this is, when you're looking at the PV of external debt to GDP in this example, well, you are seeing that even if this country is below the thresholds, it's actually very close to the thresholds. On looking at the liquidity ratios, so the external debt service to exports and the external debt service to revenues, what you are seeing here is that, again, we are identifying some specific liquidity pressures, notably in 2027 and in 2028. So, first, you would need to have a look at your current DSA. Where are your current debt profile pressures, and assess any type of new financing proposal within this specific profile. So that's why, if you are looking at this, if you are a country with having similar debt profile, you are considered here as a medium, with a moderate risk of debt distress. Right? Why is that? Because you are always below the threshold under the baseline scenario, but in specific shocks, you are above the thresholds. So this corresponds to the definition of being in a moderate risk of debt distress. So this was the first step. Second step, you need to assess if your new financing is considered as a domestic or as an external debt. Here, looking at the IMF definition of what is external debt and what is domestic debt. As Victor was mentioning, the IMF's primary definition is to say that if the residency of your creditor is external, then the debt is external. If it's a resident that is holding your debt, then the debt is considered as domestic. The issue is that some countries might not have this information, so in specific cases, the IMF will use the currency criteria, so whether it's foreign-dominated or locally dominated debt as a proxy for the debt definition. On why is it important to have to do this? First, because, well, for countries that are currently under an IMF program, you might have a debt limit policy that is going to limit the amount of debt you can contract. On the second, as we were looking before, if it's external or a domestic debt, this will have a different impact on your DSA ratios, right? If it's a domestic debt, so it basically means that the ratio that we were looking before, any new debt occurrence will not impact your external debt ratios. So this was the second step. Third step is looking at the present value on the constitutionality degree of your new debt and compare it to your debt limit policy when you are under an IMF program. So here we are reminding you of the definition of how to calculate the present value of this new debt. But actually the IMF also have what they call a PV tool instrument that you can download online and that can automatically compute the present value of any new borrowing. Or if you want to do it by hand, well, you have the formula address here. And obviously you will need to know if this new debt is considered as concessional, as semi-concessional, or as commercial by the IMF, right? If if you are below 35% of a grant element, above it, or even with a negative grant element. On the final step that we were proposing to do is to check the impact of this new financing proposal on your external DSA indicators. So here, how to do again is first look updating your funding plan to include these new instruments in your DSA, and to look, in the case that we were looking before, if you still remain at a moderate risk of debt distress. And to do so, what you actually need to do is to just make sure that you remain below the thresholds for the 4 indicators under the baseline scenario. So let's have a look of examples on how we can do that. So in the first case study, we are going to compare different concessional financing. Okay, the financing one is looking at a loan that is offered by a bilateral partner that is non-resident, so by definition an external debt, for an amount of $1 billion, of interest rate of 4.5%, a grace period of 5 years, and a maturity of 20 years. So, as I was saying, this loan is considered as external debt. Then we have here computed for you the present value of this loan. The present value is $956 million. So this is a grant element of 4%. As a result, this instrument is not considered as concessional, but more as semi-concessional. In the second financing proposal that you have received here in our example is a financing from a multilateral partner, here again non-resident, for also $1 billion, for a 3.25% interest rate, 10-year grace period, and 25 years of maturity. So again, in this example, the debt is considered as external. The PV here is lower, so 798 million. Because the PV is lower, well, the grant element here is higher, right? Because the grant element is just the difference, well, it's the relative difference between the present value and the nominal value of your loan. So in this case, since it's 20% but still not reaching the 35% thresholds, the instrument is also considered as semi-concessional. What we're going to do now is looking at the impact on our DSA ratios of incorporating these two loan proposals. So that's what we have here. What we are looking here is, well, if this specific country is contracting these two loans, well, we are looking here at a breach, right? We are breaching the PV of external debt to GDP ratio because of these two additional loans. Moreover, what we are looking is that the space that we had on our liquidity ratios, so namely the external debt service to export ratios on the debt service to revenue ratios, is today even narrower. So this means that if tomorrow this country would like to contract even more debt, well, the space available is even narrower. So, okay, here we're saying we're going to be very theoretical, but mechanically speaking, by contracting these two loans, the country will not be considered at a high risk of debt distress. Okay, even if the breach it's only for 2 years, but still mechanically, I would say, it's in a high risk of debt distress. So the country might not be willing to take these two loans simultaneously. What they can do instead is comparing these two instruments and check which one is the most favorable. That's what we're looking here. So here we're going to compute and compare the grant elements of these two loans. One is at 4%, the second one is at 20%. So what we can say here is that the instrument 2 is presenting more favorable financing conditions as compared to the first one. Then we're going to check whether if the country is just contracting the second instrument, is it going to remain below our ratios? This is what we have done here. Remember, before we were looking at the two ratios that were under pressure, so the PV of debt to GDP on the external debt service to exports. What we are seeing here is that actually the impact is quite limited when only contracting one of these loans. So for the specific country, well, we can say that they might not have the space to contract these two loans simultaneously, but contracting one of them at least will not create too much pressure on their DSA profile. Second case study, looking here much more on commercial financing. And I think this one is even more interesting because it might be, I would say, counterintuitive. So here I'm looking at two additional financings. The first one is a Eurobond. So it's a short-term Eurobond because we are looking at $750 million for 5.5% interest rate with a maturity of 7 years on a grace period of 4 years. Well, what we're looking here is that because the interest rate is above 5%, 5% being the discount rate used in the DSA, we do have here a negative grant element. But a point to bear in mind as well is that in the DSA, actually the PV of your debt will be capped at the nominal value when the grant element is negative. On the second instrument that we are going to assess here is another commercial debt, but here from a commercial partner, again non-resident, with a 5% interest rate on a 4-year maturity. So, looking here at the impact of the first instrument. So here we're looking only at the impact of the Eurobond. What we are saying is that this Eurobond is creating liquidity pressure during the years where we already have some liquidity pressure, okay? So actually it's going to increase the pressure when we are already in pressure. So it's not ideal from a DSA perspective. That's why what we are seeing here is that, well, it's maybe not ideal to take this type of loan because we already have some refinancing peaks at that during these specific years. So it's better to move it either before or after, ideally after. Because this specific Eurobond is creating this liquidity pressure, we are now mechanically at a high risk of debt distress. The Eurobond that we are currently contemplating is creating additional liquidity pressure, so additional debt service, where we already have some maturity peaks. So this is not ideal, and that's why we are because of this Eurobond, if we are contracting this Eurobond, we will be in a high risk of debt distress. On this, when we compare it to the second instruments that we have been receiving proposals, well, this one actually, the repayment schedule is happening before the peak. So that's why when you are looking at the DSA profile, well, the additional debt service that you are looking at is before the peak, right? What you can see here is on the debt service to export, on the debt service to revenue ratios, so the two ratios that you have at the bottom of the slide, well, you see here where the additional debt service lies on, well, it's happening during the first year of the loan. So even if from a conceptual point of view, this might not be ideal, right? Because, well, we are creating additional debt service on the short term. Well, from a DSA perspective, you do have some space to repay this debt during the first years of your DSA. So, in the example here, actually, well, it makes sense from a pure DSA perspective to contract this debt rather than the Eurobond that we were looking before. Thank you very much. Obviously, here we are looking at the different the proposal from a pure DSA perspective, but that's not it. Usually, what we recommend to countries to do is to do a thorough analysis, looking also at the potential positive impact this financing might have, right? Because here, what we are looking is only on the negative side from a DSA perspective, but actually this project might also increase your GDP, might increase your export or increase your revenues. And to do comprehensive analysis, what we will recommend is also looking at, let's say, the road that you're going to finance. What are the projected additional exports that this road is going to allow? Or what are the additional revenues that the government is supposed to receive? So actually, you always need to look at the negative side, as I was explained before, on your DSA perspective, but also on the positive elements that this project is bringing to the economy. And it's only by balancing these two that you're actually going to assess whether this specific loan is making sense for your country or not. Thank you very much. And the floor is open for questions, if any.
My question actually would be on your first presentation, because there was no opportunity at the time. You know, in the step 5 of your first presentation, when you are assessing the risk, you know, because we saw that, you know, in many African countries, the use of debt is a bigger problem, because either it's misappropriated or projects not completed. At the end of the day, the burden of repayment comes without the necessary benefits of the debt. So in assessing the risk, would it also not be necessary, you know, to see how it can be modeled in terms of use of proceeds? Because misuse of proceeds will be a risk, you know, to the repayment, the ability to repay. Yeah. So that's my question, where the use of proceeds, where there could be a way, how that can be modeled and also tracked in our assessment of risk of the of debt. So my second part is in the credit guarantees. You know, of course, there are a lot of discussions, and from your analysis, when there are guarantees, it can make it easier or to access funding in the ICM or with other creditors on favorable terms. The favorable terms on those credits. But the guarantee also comes with a cost. You know, do we also put that as part of the cost, you know, and then still assess it to be more beneficial than without guarantees? Because if you only focus on the favorable terms of assessing those markets, you know, because there's a guarantee, without looking into what's the guarantee cost also as part of the cost of that, you know, instrument. So I think, what's your view on that in terms of analyzing and presenting all in cost? I think that would be more informative than to only indicate that you access the ICM or a particular creditor on favorable time because there's a guarantee. Yeah. Thank you.
Bonjour tout le monde, merci pour ces deux présentations qui étaient très claires. Ma question est relative à la première présentation. J'avais levé la main, mais apparemment, ce n'était pas visible. Par rapport aux instruments que vous avez présentés, il y a les questions relatives à la classification et aux caractéristiques même des instruments. C'est par rapport à l'expérience de la Côte d'Ivoire, comme vous semblez connaître un peu la zone UEMOA, qui a fait récemment une émission d'Eurobond et libellée en francs CFA. Donc, il me semble que c'était la première du genre. Et d'après ce que vous avez présenté, la classification, c'est en termes de résidence et de libellé. Donc là, dans ce cas, puisqu'on parle d'Eurobond et qui sont libellés en francs CFA, donc je voudrais savoir d'abord comment cette classification pourrait être faite. Et la deuxième question, peut-être vous pourrez confirmer si c'est bien réel que ces eurobonds seront remboursés en francs CFA. Je peux comprendre l'intérêt pour le pays, ce sera moins de pression sur les réserves de change lors du remboursement. Mais pour l'investisseur, le créancier étranger, quel est pour lui l'intérêt de faire un décaissement en devises étrangères et de se faire rembourser en monnaie locale du pays, et sur le plan technique même, comment ça fonctionne? Merci.
Je voudrais juste poser une question de clarification. Dans votre exposé, vous avez bien explicité au moment où on fait le calcul de degré de concessionnalité pour des prêts concessionnaires ou semi-concessionnaires avec un élément qui est donc positif. Moi, ça, je comprends très bien sa signification financière. J'aimerais que vous puissiez me donner une précision pour ces prêts avec des conditions purement commerciales qui fait ressortir un élément négatif quelle est donc sa signification financière? Merci.
Okay, yeah, maybe I can take these ones. So first, on the inclusion of the use of proceeds, indeed, it's very important to incorporate them in your assessment of your risk, of incorporating a new debt. This is I think one of the key elements that I was concluding with by saying that, well, you also need to look at whether the project that you're going to finance is going to provide substantial macroeconomic benefits, right? And that's what we are doing here at GSA with our team of macroeconomic researchers on trying to look for, and we did this, for example, with a project, with a specific project with the World Bank, where we looked at the impact of a dam, of constructing a dam, on how the positive impact of this specific dam will then have second, third, or X round of impact on the overall economy. So let's take the example of the dam. So it will have obviously a positive impact on your energy sector. On this energy sector has a specific correlation with, I would say, the industries or with the construction sectors. So for each country, what we would recommend is to look at the correlations between the different sectors on how an impact of one specific sector will then have an impact on the overall economy. So this is a type of analysis indeed that are very important when looking at projects. Yes, we do recommend definitely to look at it in more details. Second questions on the credit guarantees, on whether the additional cost of the guarantees are well integrated. Indeed, it is a very important matter to have in mind. On obviously, from a theoretical point of view, well, the cost of the guarantee should not offset or completely offset the benefits of this guarantee, right? So then it will just be a matter of how well perceived is this guarantee for your creditor. If it's a guarantee for, I would say, a multilateral financial institutions like the World Bank or the African Development Bank that has a AAA rating, well, and that is covering a large amount of the loan, well, it will able to significantly reduce your interest rate that the bank is proposing. Let's say that this is enabling you to reduce it by 400 basis point. Well, if the cost is only a 100, true that the cost is here, but overall the economics are making sense. Usually from our own experience with guarantees is that usually, well, the additional cost of the guarantee is always lower than the benefits. But this is also a specific point that these institutions are looking at when granting some guarantees. Otherwise, if it doesn't make sense, well, they will not go for it. Even more, like for example, there are some countries that are looking to buy back some domestic debt or to buy back some external debt by using these guarantees. What the World Bank or the World Bank will do to assess it, they will look at the financial of the operations, right? They will look if the amount that the savings that you are making by buying back your domestic debt or your external debt is higher than the fact of just giving you a concessional loan, because basically you are using your allocation, your country allocation for this guarantee. So they are always going to assess whether the allocation is better used for a concessional loan or for a guarantee, because it's enabling you to make some savings through the liability management operations. So anyway, your point is very relevant, and that's why these institutions, when looking at this type of operations, they are looking at it and they are ensuring that the impact is here before going forward. On the question on the classification of the instruments for Ivory Coast, so indeed, as I was saying, so the residency. So I'm not sure actually. Ivory Coast did a lot of issuances recently using guarantees, etc. So I'm not sure which one are you referring to, but let's speak from a theoretical point of view. Indeed, if it's a Eurobond, and I think what they might have done is then having a swap. So it was a Eurobond usually issued in USD, and then they swap it indeed, even it's a local currency bond. Well, because the creditors are external, well, it will be considered as an external debt in your DSA. So that's the first point. On why does it make sense for the countries and for the creditors to have local currency external bonds? Well, it can be twofold. First, for the government, well, it's easier, right? Because your revenues are in local currency. So Ivory Coast revenues are in XOF. So they will. It's easier for them if the debt service is in XOF as well. So you don't have any type of currency risk on your balance sheet. On second point of view, for the creditor itself, well, usually actually what is very important for them is to make sure that they are able to get the country out of to get the currency and to be able to convert it to a foreign currency to get it out of the country. So that's why actually for them, again, I don't know the specifics of the transaction that you are mentioning, but for them what would be very important is to make sure that from a balance of payment perspective, they have the ability to take the debt service out of the country. On if they are themselves protected against the currency risk, well, they might be fine to lend in local currency. And then the last question on the constitutionality degree, on what is the signification of having negative grant element. Well, from a pure mathematical point of view, or maybe I will come back to the formula. Okay, so one of the key elements of this formula is actually the discount rate that you're using on one side, on the cash flow on the other side. Okay, so if you have a negative grant element, it just means that the interest rate that you are receiving from your creditor is above 5%. Okay, so it's very simple. So usually what we are seeing is that when an interest rate is above 5%, you will have a negative grant element. Well, it depends on the timing on when I'm saying this, but usually it's true that commercial creditors are usually providing interest rate above 5%. So is there any other questions? No? Okay, thank you very much for this.